Today we're talking about the feeling of home and belonging. And what's interesting is that even though I'm from Canada, completely different, physical home, I can completely relate to every single thing that we're talking about. And it's great because the three speakers before me relate so heavily to what I want to talk about. So growing up, and to this day, anytime the song Apna Punjab would come on by Gurdas Mann, I would sing it at the top of my lungs, as if it was me, as if it was my Punjab that I left at home with my parents. And that through my life, that feeling followed me. The feeling that my home wasn't where I was born or raised, but in some faraway land of my parents that I've only been able to visit once. But when you think about it, it's a bit strange, isn't it? Like Harwinder was talking about. It wasn't why didn't I feel at home where I went to school, where I had my friends, where I played sports. But instead it was this beautiful visionary land of the stories of my dad and my grandfather and Kate's and all the songs that we would, watch on the TV. But I also realized that others felt the same as me. That we were all longing, of my generation, all longing for this space, this back home. I even still call it back home. And when I'm here, it confuses me and confuses others, because really back home is Canada, but not. And it was as if Sikh youth around the world felt as we had our feet in two places at the same time, but never fully in one spot. One foot here, wherever you were born and raised, and one foot here in Punjab. And so these themes of belonging have become even more prevalent since 9/11. Because where our so-called actual homelands of birth and raising rejected us within an instant as terrorists, right? And since we didn't actually even belong back home in India either, we never had a home to call home in the first place. But what really began to intrigue me were the moments of active mobilizations of different racialized communities in the diaspora. The passion with which they fought with their voices to be heard on behalf of their brothers and sisters back home. And it was the second generation youth leading the charge on this, right? So for example, there was the Tamil community all around the world doing coordinated protests against the Tamil genocide in 2009. It was mind-blowing. The Palestinians around the world in protesting the siege of Gaza in 2009. Again, this beautiful, massive, transnational, coordinated effort to fight for social justice in a back home, in a homeland. And again, in 2011, protests all around the world in solidarity with the Egyptian revolution. And so when I was watching these protests happening, it was amazing because the rhetoric of the government, the mainstream, the media, and just general people was, why are they bringing their issues from back home here? Why should we care? These people are Canadian citizens, British citizens, Australian citizens. Why do they care so much about what's happening back home? And despite having legal rights to protest, these communities were quickly labeled as supporting terrorists or not patriotic enough of their own nations. And I think I just said this, but it was interesting because this happens all the time to Sikhs. They were particularly told always to leave their issues at home, right? And I had friends there who were out there on the streets. I had friends who were fighting with the trauma of their parents, fighting that same struggle that their parents left behind. Hell, I was on the streets with them. And I was like, I was pissed. Oh wait, not drunk, angry. British lingo, right? How dare the people and the mainstream just quickly brush us aside and tell us that we don't deserve to be heard? And us, we were like, we're Canadian citizens. Isn't this what you bring us up to tell us? You tell us all the time that we have the right to voice our opinions as long as we do it peacefully, but when we do, we're told that it's completely invalid? And it wasn't until Sikh youth in Toronto began organizing in Canada politically, like the second generation, did I begin to really understand what was happening. Maybe because this time it was about me, personally. The first instance that started really getting me thinking was the Kamal Nath protest in 2010. And in Toronto, Kamal Nath was arriving now for the 6th time in Canada. And Kamal Nath was a minister, an Indian minister of something else, and now he's an Indian minister of something else now. And he is accused of being heavily a part of the Delhi genocide in 1984. Yet, as an alleged perpetrator, he is continuously, actively moving around the world internationally. Moving around the world. And so the Sikh youth, aware of that this was going to happen, started coordinating with the Gurdwaras and decided to do an email writing campaign, a phone campaign, started doing Facebook things to get their MPs and MPPs to, make a stand about this. That, you're not going to allow a human rights violator to come into Canada. But there was no response. Actually, a lot of the response was, we don't make comments on international affairs. And so the youth decided to hold a protest. And they did. 500 people stood on a sidewalk quietly in the rain, chanted, protested, took some buses, went home. It was an incredibly beautiful moment for those youth and the community members, because that was the first time in a long time that something like that had been done. It wasn't a big deal, except until the newspaper articles came out, right? And MPs and commentators and things like that started equating Sikh youth, me, my friends, my family, the old Bappa and Bibi, who were like survivors of the trauma of 84, as second generation extremists. I was like, are you kidding? Like, we stood on a sidewalk in the rain. Us, 20-something-year-olds, second generation extremists. Mind blown. But I wasn't really that shocked. I had become prepared to expect it, especially as a Sikh growing up in Canada. But it wasn't until the Rajwana protest that the light bulb really clicked. Because in 2012, people really couldn't understand why we were protesting for Rajwana. Why were we protesting for an alleged terrorist? That means they're actively aligning themselves with terrorists. And then I realized there was no point in even explaining. It hit me. There was no point in even explaining to people who have never had to resist a government. Trying to explain to mainstream communities who have been taught from day one to always trust the government, that the government is never wrong. When we colonized peoples have active and very recent histories of never trust the government and always stand up for your rights and don't wait for it to be given to you. It's about when you stand up and fight for it. And I realized that it was like, we know what it's like when a government suppresses us. We know what it's like to have hundreds of years of domination and what it means to stand up against oppression. Of course they won't understand what we're talking about, right? So, what was the big light bulb I had because of this Rajwana moment? Despite regularly being told that we don't belong, that we have to actively prove our Canadianness, actively prove our Englishness, or whatever it is, or we're constantly told to go back to where we came from, even though that might just be Southall, or Hounslow, or Toronto. There's something really beautiful and amazing that's happening. And what isn't being understood is that the Sikh youth are carrying multiple loyalties, and we aren't willing to negotiate any of them. We are actively engaging with the political identities and the rich histories of our parents and our ancestors that have been actively denied under the guise of multiculturalism. So, although our parents had to give up their political identities to belong and accept music, language, clothes, and food as the appropriate ways of being a citizen, we have decided to change what that means to us. And we are taking it on. And we're taking their histories on and saying, we are not forgetting. And we don't sit by complacently. We are creating a new form of citizenship that is based in a sense of responsibility to a back home, but is grounded heavily in our current home. And we are not bound by lines drawn on a map. And because we are holding these multiple loyalties to communities globally, and holding a connectedness that goes beyond nation states. So it's not about people in England with people in India. No, it's my brothers and sisters in Punjab, Canada, UK. It's not about these boundaries and these borders. And this form of global citizenship is heavily based in fighting for social justice through this international, transnational movement. And by fighting for social justice globally, we're connecting with other movements for change who have been suffering for the same struggles with us. So when the Tamil protests were happening in Toronto, the Sikhs were there. And when the Rajwana protests were happening in India, the Tamils were putting out banners saying they support it. And it is us, the colonized people, who recognize home as beyond borders and lines and passports. We aren't narrow characters, but multifaceted people who carry a sense of responsibility and awareness of the privilege that our citizenship in Western nation states carries. And by using this privilege to help voice what is necessary for our brothers and sisters and family around the world. Because we are no different than our brothers and sisters around the world, no matter how much they try to tell us that we're different than the freshies or the refugees or whatever we choose to call them. We're the same. So your voice is the most powerful thing you have. The question is, what will you do with it? Thank you.